In my experience, there are two concepts that are pretty difficult for board members and committee members to get a grasp on, and that is conflict of interest and bias. And I think everyone would agree that they're very important for fair and transparent decision making, and they're related and they're easy to get confused, but they are two different concepts. Maybe we can start with conflict of interest. Can you describe what conflict of interest means in the context of a board?
I'm going to ask Richard to flesh this out in greater detail, but when I think of conflict of interest, I think of some decision, not maybe a decision of a hearing committee, but a policy decision that impacts on a board member in a special way that perhaps isn't shared by others. Richard?
Yes. Conflict of interest arises in three basic contexts. One is if you have a monetary interest in the outcome of the decision, for example, your brother-in-law's tendering for a contract. If you have a personal connection, that someone that you like, a friend of yours, is involved in a matter. The third is where there is an issue that you are very, very strong on, that you are associated with, in which you just can't have the neutrality and impartiality that's required for someone who is sitting on a board.
So, who decides whether you have a conflict of interest or not?
Well, I think it starts with the individual board member to conscientiously ask himself or herself if there is a conflict of interest. It can, of course, involve the chair or president of the board, and sometimes it can involve the legal advisor to the board. You see, sometimes people are so conscientious about conflicts of interest that they raise concerns about their ability to participate in board decisions when, in fact, there really isn't some sort of special or disqualifying interest at stake. So that's why sometimes canvassing that issue with others can be very beneficial.
For sure. You have to remember that it's an objective test. It's whether a person who is observing the situation, who knows the information, a reasonable person would say, you know, I'm concerned that you have an appearance that you might be influenced by these other considerations. It's not a subjective thing. It's not I'm not going to be influenced by this factor, so it doesn't matter. It's not subjective, it's objective. And so you need to, ultimately, it's up to the council or the board to decide whether someone has a conflict if they won't recognize it.
So, if I think I have a conflict, what should I do at a board meeting?
I think you should raise the issue. If you feel strongly about it, then you should recuse yourself. That is, voluntarily step aside from that decision and let others make the decision.
Does that
in your
mean
absence.
I need to leave the room, or does that just mean I need to not take part in the decision?
It may depend on whether your presence could impact on the decision. Often the best advice is to leave the room.
Yeah, I routinely say to anyone who has declared a conflict or has been viewed as a conflict that they should leave the room. I think that's just
safer that way.
It's just safer because sometimes if people know what your position is, there could be some subtle pressure that you might not even feel yourself, but other people might feel who might be more sensitive.
Now, a sticky situation could arise where one board member believes that another board member is in a conflict of interest and they have not chosen to come forward with that. What should a board member do when they're concerned about someone else?
I think that courtesy dictates that you raise it with the other board member one-on-one before raising it with the chair or president of the board. And the reason for that is that it may be that the other board member really hasn't turned his or her mind to the issue at all. And then, you know, on reflection, thinks right away, well, wait a minute, I do have some sort of special interest in how this issue is determined. So I should step aside. I think that's a much more productive process than making a motion in open session to the board as a whole.
I agree, and that just helps the board function better. If that doesn't work, then go to the chair. And if the chair doesn't agree and you feel it's important, then you would raise it with the entire board. As I say, it's an objective decision. It's not a subjective one.
Now, I'm intrigued by your statement that it's an objective decision. Who makes it ultimately?
Well, ultimately, it's the board as a whole. They would look at it, and I suppose there is the potential in rare circumstances to take that to a court. That doesn't happen very often, but it can, and a court will feel quite comfortable in applying an objective test. They're not going to say, was this person biased or not? They're going to say, did this person have a conflict of interest or not? But they will say, looking at the circumstances, knowing the facts, would a reasonable person feel that this person might be influenced by this other factor?
And you use the term special interest, so that's another sort of way of thinking about it, as well as a conflict of interest, but a special interest, so you would, special interest in the result. Is that what you're referring to?
I would, because you have to recognize that other members of the board, being members of the profession, would have the same interest as you would. And that's expected in our system of professional self-regulation, that all professional members of the board would have that interest. If they all, of course, declared a conflict of interest and stepped aside, then the board couldn't function.
Right.
So that's why I use the term special interest.
Right.
Take the example of whether you're going to raise fees. Every professional member on the board will be affected by that decision, but that does not disqualify them.
Right. Now, is there ever a time when someone can continue to be part of a decision when they are in a conflict of interest?
Well, my view is that there isn't, that you can't continue to be involved if you're in a conflict of interest, because it impacts not only on the quality of the decision, but in the optics, the perception surrounding the decision.
I agree entirely. If there's a conflict of interest or even an appearance of conflict of interest, you can't participate no matter what. There are rare occasions where someone, out of an abundance of caution, might decide not to participate in something just to be absolutely safe. And if it turned out that their presence was absolutely essential to maintain quorum, you might revisit that issue. But that's a different scenario from someone saying, I have a conflict of interest on this issue, I have to step aside.
Now, you've mentioned appearance of conflict of interest, so there's that objective view where it's not necessarily that you would benefit, but that it would appear that you might. Is that a fair statement, that you also need to consider that someone else would consider you might be in a position?
I think that's a valid consideration. I also think, though, that you have to strike the right balance, because often when board members conscientiously think about conflicts of interest, they consider issues that may not really be material in the overall context. So I think we have to be measured in the way we approach this. Clearly, perception is important, because one of the central points to be made about professional self-regulation is that public confidence is something that can't be lost. We have to strive to maintain it. So in that sense, perception is very important. But we have to be realistic and practical about it as well.
You have to not take it personally. There's no criticism of you of having a conflict of interest or having appearance of conflict of interest if you declare it and remove yourself. There's no failing on your part. It's just a circumstance you're in. Sometimes people take it personally and they resist accepting that there might be a conflict of interest because they think they would look badly for stepping down. And I think that's the mistake that's often made.
So it sounds like one of the best strategies when there's any thought that there might be a conflict of interest is to bring it forward either to the chair, some of your other board members, or in the meeting itself, and have a discussion and go from there.
That's absolutely right.
Sure. Or to legal counsel.